This was just, it was such a wide, sprawling expanse, and we knew that it was coming.
The winds out there are so strong, you could see the water just rising and crashing onto their sandbags. It's unbelievable.
The power of the water moving across the field it's biblical.
At the same time that they were building up the dike, they were also pulling out the furniture, boarding up the windows. They were basically condemning the house.
It's hard to cover a flood because it's not really a story. It's a life event for people.
1 in 300 years means basically that you've never seen anything like this before. And that was the feeling.
This is real, this is not a drill. This is a mandatory evacuation. People must leave.
From the air, Brandon looked like it was being swallowed up. I mean, even from the air, you could see they built this giant wall to protect it. But wow, there was like a mountain of water coming at it.
It came from the west and down the Assiniboine River Basin, as opposed to what we expect here in Manitoba, which is down the Red. As experts said, it was a 1 in 300 year flood. And so I was walking into locations that I had never been before, talking to people who had never seen this water before.
This flood, the water was coming up, and it was not hesitating, it wasn't apologizing, it was just getting bigger and bigger and bigger.
1 in 300 years was a term that they used to talk about the flooding in Brandon. And the thing about that is, it boggles the mind to think in terms of 1 in 300 years, because it's so much longer than any of our lifespans. Like, you drive down into the valley and then you look at this huge sandbag dike that's taller than the car that you're in, and you realize that there's water on the other side of that.
Usually floods in Manitoba are quite rural, not something so urban-based. You saw a frenzy. You saw a community scurrying to get itself ready. I had never seen a super sandbag before, and that was quite a sight.
It was prolonged, it went on for weeks. And so even though they could drive by and they could see their homes and they knew they were dry, they couldn't go in them. And I think that that was one of the most stressful things for people.
You know, we're coming to the gravy now. The community just comes together. We're having fine times. We're boating, we're on a lakefront property.
The thing that struck me about Dave Barnes was his attitude. It was this image of him. He was in a canoe. You could tell he was really good at a canoeist, and his canoe's filled with sandbags, and he's cutting through the river, and it's like pylons through trees, and you see this kind of long, straggly, hippie hair blowing in the wind. He looked like this kind of old man in the river, you know, and he was not going to quit. For him, his insurance was his friends. That's kind of the oldest type of insurance that you can have, is friendship, people that you can rely on. And for me, that was what I was struck by, was how community was the true insurance for this group of people.
The controlled release will start tomorrow morning, but we'll be able to do it in a measured way.
Hoop and Holler is a bend in the road. That's it. But it became the focus. This little piece of road in the middle of nowhere became the focus for this flood fight, because it was where they decided it would do the least amount of damage to cut the road and to let the water out.
It was such a surreal experience, and you could see, you just knew when you were talking to these people, it hadn't quite hit them yet what they were about to go through. You can tell someone that there's a chance that their home is going to be flooded when they thought they were safe, you know, a day ago. And it registers in their head, but when it comes down to it, you look in their eyes and you can kind of see that at that stage it hasn't quite sunk in yet.
Down around where they did the controlled cut, to a person, everyone that I talked to, they were extremely unhappy with the speed of the decision. It was like, okay, Monday everything's fine. Tuesday, they were sandbagging their home.
Somebody looked at me and said, Alex, this is not an act of God, it's an act of politics. We're okay if nature's fury is going to bring something down on us because it's uncontrollable. Here's a situation where the officials, the people who are meant to keep you safe, are making a specific decision to put you and your family and your livelihood in the path of this water. It's not something that you expect, but it's something that they suddenly had to deal with.
Building a new house, what's going to be left when we get back, you know?
We're going to get a bunch of water here whether we like it or not. It could affect our livelihood.
It looks like they're going to destroy our property and everyone else's property around here.
It is coming through that slot that they've cut for it at a fairly good rate.
It was difficult for them to digest that a disaster was going to be forced upon them to save others. It was tense. People were saying they had no information, that the government wasn't telling them much, that they weren't being provided with the details on how tall to build their dikes. At one point there was a sandbag shortage. People who were preparing to sandbag overnight couldn't.
For several days before that, people were frantically preparing for what they had no idea what was to come. And I think that was one of the most extraordinary things. We don't know where exactly the water is going to go. They didn't have proper surveys in the area, and so you were preparing for something that was in the unknown.
Like, I remember talking to one guy, and it was just like a normal conversation, and I said, hey, did you hear the revision to the crest dates? It's going to be five days later. And he just broke down. Like, he totally just was overwhelmed and, you know, had tears and everything. And it was just a reminder to me that, you know, even though the flooding isn't, you know, necessarily taking these people's homes, just the threat and the uncertainty and the unknown of the whole situation is a heavy burden on these people.
You know, in fact, in those hours when the cut was made and they're waiting for the water to come, this woman said to me, it's like I'm in the dentist chair and you can hear the drill in the next room and you know they're in pain and you know that pain is coming your way. Even though it might be for the better of everybody, I'm still dreading that pain.
When the cut was finally made, and the first thing that went through my mind was, wow, they've done it. They've actually cut this road, this dike open. And then my thoughts immediately went to all the people that were going to be seeing all this footage rolling out in front of my camera, and all their fears were suddenly materializing. And I'm going, wow, I didn't know what to think at that point.
Covering a flood is a crazy jumble of emotions. On the one hand, you've got people who are fearing for their lives, their livelihoods. And on the other hand, you have this incredible outpouring of human emotion. People willing to do whatever they need to do to step up and help their neighbor. They don't need to know who they are. They just know they need help.
Have you ever lifted a sandbag? They are heavy. I couldn't imagine doing that for days and days at a time, 12, 14 hours a day. And these people, they just did it. No questions asked. I didn't hear one complaint ever from anyone on one sandbagging line.
I wanted to go find the unsung heroes, go to a different area where people were just helping, coming out of the woodwork to help. So I went to the community of Oakville. I knew they had a community center, very well organized there, and said, who should I talk to? Who are the heroes of this flood fight that nobody knows about? And everybody pointed at everybody else.
I walked into one yard and there was elements of the Canadian Air Force, elements of the Army, neighborhood volunteers, and this family's extended uncles and aunts and cousins. They'd all arrived to sandbag around a house. And as I was talking to the homeowner, some guy pulled up in a van. He unloaded a half a dozen huge boxes of muffins and coffee. He put them down for the volunteers, and he turned to leave. In the homeowner, the lady said, wait, I haven't even thanked you. And he said, I don't need any thanks. And he got in his car and he left. I mean, that I saw played over and over and over again. Just generosity that came from the heart and never stopped, and didn't expect any thanks.
When you see a greenhouse that is the only source of income for 7 members of one family, and that greenhouse is right in the path of the water, and then you've got an army of 50 people that show up and just start tossing huge sandbags and spending the entire day fortifying that property, at the end of the day, the look from behind that wall of sand on the people's faces is something you'll never forget, ever, ever, ever.
I mean, you just get this immense respect for the people there. They're working their tails off, and you never hear anyone complaining. Everyone is absolutely selfless.
I went searching for one unsung hero, and I found hundreds of them. I heard stories about the guys who they were construction workers and had stopped making money for a whole week and come down just to organize things, just to donate their trucks and their heavy equipment. People who lost a lot of money and didn't even necessarily live in the community, but gave it all up just to come help.
One thing that many of us have observed in covering this flood is the true spirit of Manitobans and how it came out and how it comes out in times like these, because people didn't hesitate to, sandbag a house, pick up, jump in their trucks and get over to the neighbor who needed that as well.
It's amazing, like the resilience that you see in people is, it's really compelling, because some people would just give up and maybe walk away, but some of these people day in, day out offered to help one another, reached out, continued to work hard, and it's not easy lifting all those sandbags and protecting your property, but it was amazing to see people come together that had no connection to one another.
So Lake Manitoba was the unknown because it was already so full. People around the lake felt that not enough room was left for the unknown. Well, then the unknown happened.
I was there in the daytime. It was still calm, and with half an hour, all hell broke loose.
For us here in the city, we really don't understand the struggles that people go through. People sandbagging, all morning into the evening, having to go out every day and grab more sandbags. And on Lake Manitoba, watching those levels rise and rise and rise, and now these strong winds, it's just, it's hard to, what if it was, you ask yourself, what if it was me? What would happen to me if it was my home, if it was a family member's home? Those questions kind of run through your mind, and you just can't help but feel the emotions that these other people are going through.
I had traveled up to Fairford Reserve and Lake St. Martin Reserve, and I had been there and taped the reserves as they were evacuated. So I saw like the sandbag dikes with the water slowly rising up, and I saw that a good wind or a good rain would easily push that water over the dikes and drench hundreds of these houses.
There's a man we spoke to up at Fairford. He was on the reserve. He was sitting on his front porch when we got there. We're sitting there, and just in front of his house is a bit of a meadow, and then there's a road, and there's another big meadow, and that water is coming. The water is up to the road, and it's starting to come around the house. And so we sat on the porch next to him, and I could see he's kind of, trying to keep a little bit of humor about this. And he looked at me and said, yeah, most people really would love to have waterfront property like this. And he kind of chuckled. And so we're talking, and so I'm asking him, well, what do you think is going to happen here? And he says, well, I know that I'm going to be living in a campground or a motel for the duration of the summer. And at this point, I really don't believe I'll be coming back to this house.
Well, the one story that sticks out in my mind was when I went to go to a cattle farm not far from Ashern. The fields that his cattle would graze in were covered in water, and when we went there, he was scrambling with some of his other family members to, you know, brand the cattle, get them ready, move out. He had to move out at least 1,500 head of cattle. For him, this is a farm that is, again, run through, you know, generations in his family, and it was heartbreaking to see, you know, the pain in his eyes that something that his family has worked so hard for and that he's worked so hard for was in jeopardy.
Covering the flood this year more than any other time, it was that sense of desperation. No matter where we went, people would they wanted to show you. They needed to show you. They needed you to remember what was happening, to see it. So this rancher took us to around his property, and he drove us up and down roads, and he kept repeating, you need to understand what this is you're looking at. It's a flooded field, sure, but it's my livelihood. It's my life.
We drove by the cemetery in Lake St. Martin, and the cemetery was sandbagged because the lake was coming up on the cemetery. And in the graveyard were fresh graves and an open grave because they were going to have the funeral for this person amidst this, in this graveyard, which was about to be overcome with water from Lake St. Martin. And the entire population of the Lake St. Martin Reserve is staying at the Marlborough Hotel in downtown Winnipeg. And they're large families, you know, and they're displaced people. The parents look, you know, exhausted from looking after their kids all day. You know, they don't have any of the comforts of home. And we went to this one lady. She's living in a hotel room with 9 people. Her whole family is 9 people, and they're living in a hotel room till October. And they're smiling and laughing, and in my head I'm thinking, October?
I asked a farmer on air, I said to him, you've told me about your property, you've told me about the waves. I can tell that to people. What I can't express is how you feel about it. And I was live on the air, and I fully expected him to get angry. I was prepared for this moment where he was going to get angry at the government. And I was sitting there, and this farmer, I was on his floor, and his little girls were around me. They were 3 and 5, and it was very much just in his home. And he was sitting in a rocking chair. And when I asked him, how do you feel about what you're going through? He just started rocking back and forth in this chair. And he put his hand to his head, and he was shaking just slightly. And he completely broke down in front of the entire province, essentially. This strong, strapping rancher broke down and started crying. And what was interesting is when we got off the air, I said to him, I hope you don't feel taken advantage of, because flood stories are so deeply personal. And I felt, did I set you up to have this moment publicly? And he looked straight at me and said, no, because that was as real as it gets. And this is how stressful this is, and maybe people will remember what we're going through. And I didn't cry until after that. And then I walked out to his deck so no one would see, and I just cried.
This flood is by no means over. Lake Manitoba, it's not over by a long shot. The water hasn't even crested in that particular area. And once it does, that water is not going anywhere. The topography has changed forever in that region. As they said to me, it's not like the river, the water's going to go down, it's going to clear out. This is lake. It's not going anywhere. This is not just this year, this is for years to come. It's by no means over, it's definitely going to get worse.
In a way, it's a good news story. It sounds strange to say that about a flood, about a potential catastrophe, but it's a good news story because it's a showcase of the human spirit and the ability of Manitobans to really come together. And that's a beautiful thing to witness.
All the most positive things about, you know, being a human is like, you know, bravery, compassion, helpful spirit. You see all that stuff, and I wonder, you know, why it has to be a flood before that stuff shows.
What we saw in a lot of the First Nations and other rural communities, that even in the face of, you know, unprecedented flooding and all these natural disasters that are visiting people, they still realize that what really matters is community and fellowship and working together. And that was one of the most impressive things.
People are always so willing to help, and that, to see that sort of rekindles your faith in the human spirit sometimes when you think that, you know, humanity has just lost it. When you see things like this, it sort of, you know, makes you realize that, you know what, there are good people out there, and it's at times like this where you see that coming out.
You'll hear it from everyone that in a disaster like a flood, Manitobans come together. We really do.
I don't know, it kind of really, it makes you think how powerful nature is, and wow, what it can do to a countryside. When you see how people kind of fight back and how everybody gathers together to fight against it, it's got to impress you, and it's got to make you want to help. Being there and covering it, just documenting it, seeing everybody the way they work together was a privilege. It was a privilege for me.
When it comes to the human spirit around things like floods, you can see it everywhere. You see it with volunteers coming out, you see it with tired farmers who told me that when they were done on their properties, they were going elsewhere to still help. But on Fairford First Nation, Penamutang, and this is one of the 4 First Nations communities that in fact they're talking about potentially moving because this year's flood was so devastating. I met their flood coordinator who lived there for his whole life, and we'd done this very deep, you know, 2-hour tour and interview about what he felt. And he showed me his mom's home, and he said his mom was in the hospital having panic attacks because she'd seen water so many times over the years that she was just so stressed by it. And after this very serious interview, he said, you know, they say that as long as the sky is blue and Mother Earth is green and the rivers flow, that we shall be okay, he said in a very serious voice. And then he looked at me and he winked. He said, but I've kind of had it with the rivers flowing this year.